Hi, it's Stu, and I guess it's my paperback era. This is really interesting for me because I've recently learned that I much prefer hardback. Um, the intention of this video is mostly a review video and an unhaul. The top two books are books that I'm currently reading, and I just want to throw that out there that I'm in them. I might mention them again in a few other cases in this video, and it's very likely that there will be review videos for The Bone People. Love, 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 and little reunions. Just got enough into to starting to get engaged, but don't have strong connections to yet. In addition to that, I have an unhaul without reading. I can't really call it a DNF. I read about 50 pages into this. I read enough to appreciate Georgette Heyer's writing style. I've said multiple times that romance really isn't my genre. It's kind of stepping out of my comfort zone. And this is a Regency romance, so it's aristocracy, England, turn of the century, although don't quote me on that. But yeah, aged setting, and where I can see where a lot of people really are engaged in that genre. It feels a bit like fairy tale princess kind of genre. I don't in any way over romanticize aristocracy. In fact, I tend to prefer to problematize it. And I think that this beautiful edition would be much loved by somebody who isn't me, and I'm just willing to let it go. It's not my time to read this book, and maybe never. I just have a lot of books now, and so I feel more comfortable being discerning. However, I did give it a chance, and I did like the style. I just didn't feel, maybe also preconceived notions, but I just didn't feel it was going to offer me anything. Tough when I'm listening to The Bone People at the same time, which is something that I feel like is offering me just so many precious gifts. So I believe I'm going to let this go. I'm not going to continue reading it. I have someone in mind who I think would really like this version, this edition of it. And if not, this did come from a little free library in Great Falls, Montana, and I'm happy to redistribute it into a little free library in my city. So about the books that I did read, and I'm going to do them in the order of the most recently read. Let me see. Yes, 2 of these books were part of the reading award winners, kind of one per award, reading prompt, TBR reading prompt that I gave myself. One was both, it came off my hold shelf, so I had digital accessibility, and also was a book about books. And then one was just spring kind of cleaning, came off my hold shelf in Libby and had been there for a while. That's not the order. I said I'm going to do them in a certain order, and then it wasn't the order, so that's okay. I want to talk first about Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad. This book, as I said, was part of the TBR challenge that I had for myself to read one book per prize, and the only way that I discerned that there was a prize was by the marketing on the book. So oftentimes, if it's been, another edition's been published after the winning of an award, they do market that information on the front of the book, as in here. It looks like a sticker. However, this is not a sticker. It's actually part of the actual cover of this book. So in the promotional material here says the winner of the National Book Circle's Critic Award. After reading this book and looking into it a little, it also won a Pulitzer Prize. This book was published in 2010. I found that publication date a little bit interesting. While reading and after reading, I kept going back to it because it very much was like 1980s, 1990s angsty and loaded with triggers that were somewhat commonplace, if not expected, of that era that I, for some reason, have a memory by 2010 we'd gotten over. However, I think that's just me projecting. 2010 is now a full 15 years ago. And I think this book in a lot of ways is provocative, even as such. But I do have to say to anyone who wants to read this book, and including to my ability to engage in this book, the trauma triggers are serious. They're serious and they're abundant. I can say that one of the things that the blurb said of this book, that it was an exhilarating novel of self-destruction and redemption. I think, again, this is maybe, I'm reading this, book in 2025. And when I look at the situations of these characters, of which there are also many, many, and that in and of itself was a little hard to keep track of and intense, at least for me. I would call them self-destructive, but only in that sort of like 1990s, 1980s angsty interpretation. I think that they're engaged in systemic processes such as addiction and misogyny that are destructive, and they don't have any tools with which to interrogate their own lives. And it's just sort of in the book assumed that, oh, people just sort of self-destruct like this. And I think that there's sort of a spotlight put on, and certainly some highlighted interrogation of the recording industry, because that's like the central part of this book. And I think some of these stories absolutely needed to be told, even in the way that they were told. I don't know if I'm ever going to just be okay with or ever have been okay with nonchalant sexual violence without someone like giving me a heads up that that's what's going to, like, that's just going to happen in this book. And I know when I'm listening and there's an essay scene, I just detach. I can't listen to it. That's me. But I found those scenes disturbing in a lot of ways. And again, I think contemporary fiction would provide, or folks would be providing, trauma triggers. I did not find this book redemptive in any way, but perhaps because I was triggered and therefore I couldn't see the redemption. I also found it convoluted, might be the right word I'm looking for, because I found it really hard to keep track of all of these characters in the intertwinings of the stories. Now, I think that's part of Egan's genius, that she was able to write all of these, what some people describe of, and what I certainly experienced as a series of interconnected short stories around a sort of central figure who is this misogynistic male in the recording industry. I liked the character development. I found it hard to be engaged in this book. I thought this book there was a lot of fantastic choices and crafts used and techniques used. I didn't find it redemptive at all. Absolutely feel like people reading it need a trauma trigger warning. And in fact, if I put it into Little Free Libraries, which is my plan, I will leave some kind of a sticky note or a note that will say, if you're not someone like myself who reads up on books, go ahead and read up on this one so you're ready for the trauma triggers. One last thing I would say, there's a whole chapter that was kind of, in a nostalgic way, really delightful for me to see these sort of like PowerPoint slides from 15 years ago, graphic organizers. And I was reading the digital version of this book, and I will say one thing: the publisher should look at contrast. As someone who is now said many times that I get headaches. The contrast was really problematic and not accessible to folks who get headaches or triggered to headaches and or have some issues around contrast. There are guidelines to that now. I'm very happy to put this into a little free library. I can absolutely see why it won awards. And again, if you're going to pick up this book, you're into sort of looking, especially if you're into music and the recording industry. Yeah, punk rocky kind of stuff. This could be for you, but be ready for those like 1980s video terror. It almost was a horror for me, actually. I'm going to move on. The State of Wonder was a book that I was so excited when I hauled it. I was like, ooh, look at this. Look at this cover. And a title like State of Wonder. I had read Bel Canto, at least to the best of my recollection, by Anne Patchett. I knew only this, that the author, who I'm a little familiar with, at least to my recollection, and that this had to do with women in the Brazilian Amazons. I wasn't ready for the just power punch of interrogation of themes such as the impacts of colonization, the impacts of, in quotation, the developing world and their superior mindset on the indigenous world, the capitalistic industrial complex of medicine and pharmaceuticals, of people's own delusions, like the brain and people, the scientists in this being able to delude themselves into what is, I think, stretch the limits of what is ethical and moral practice, of femininity under the, and body autonomy under the umbrella of fertility, of who's depending on whom, and resistance and resilience. I think all of those things were woven into a fantastic story about a scientist, a pharmacologist, who finds out that her colleague and dear friend has recently passed away and is asked by the friend's wife and mother of his 3 children to head on into, fly into Manaus and then go into the rainforest to find out what happened to this man. So there's a plot line and a story that runs through, and even though there's a lot of interrogation of all of the things that I just mentioned, there's still a very clear plot line. The characters are pretty well developed, and I overall thought this was a great read. Not one that I would like give all the fanfare for, but a great read. And I'll just say this in passing, because I'll probably have moved on from thinking about this book by the time I make my next review video. But it was really interesting to be inside of these 2 books in similar times, or almost crossing into the same time, as they're both looking at the impact of colonization, and both have a young male character who cannot speak and cannot hear or speak, or it's not clear maybe in one or the other. So I'll just say that the words are not available to either of these young male characters in both of these books. And the role that they play in the story is very similar, and I don't want to spoil it, so maybe I'll get more into it in The Bone People for the necessity of kind of telling my experience with the story. But the role that they play and the role that the symbolism that they are, is especially considering that both of these young male characters are taken in by much older female characters, and also that they're of They're indigenous or of unknown. Both are of unknown, but likely indigenous descent. So really interesting that's happening. Of all of the books that I've read about all the themes, like in 2 books kind of at the same time that I'm reading them, totally stood out to me. I'm moving on to Geraldine Brooks, The People of the Book. And if you like historical fiction, for sure, this is a book for you. If you like stories about books and you feel a lot of ways, as I do when I make these videos and I tell where I get the actual physical copy of a book, if there's a bookmark in it, if there's writing in it, where I'll unhaul it, to whom I'll give it, all of this, the summation of all of this is me saying that the physical, the actual tangible copy, apart from the story inside of it or the purpose inside of it, has its own story of connecting people. And The People of the Book very much does that. It suggests that a very tangible book has the story of all of the people that touched it, that created it, that kept it alive, that's, in this case, saved it, because the particular book in question is the book used for Passover Seders for Jewish people, and it's like a family book that survives from medieval Spain through the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion of Jewish people, and services in Sarajevo under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, goes to Hungary, survives the Holocaust, and then survives the wars in which the dissembling of the former Yugoslavia happened. And so we enter the scene in the 1990s with our main character, whose name is Hannah. I really appreciate how it's spelled 2 different ways in this book, whose name is Hannah, who is sort of the modern timeline teller of the story. She's investigating the book. She's commissioned to look into the book and the condition of the book. And in this way, Geraldine Brooks, much like the author of Miss Morgan's Book Brigade, runs 2 timelines, one of someone doing research in more contemporary times, and then one of the historical story that's happening. This is just my opinion. Geraldine Brooks does a much better job of running those 2 timelines and keeping us compelled to continue to read this story by weaving in the discoveries of Hannah, who's looking into the book and finding something, kind of spoiler alert, about the cover. For instance, finding a moth's wing impressed in the book, and then weaving in the fictional story of how that moth's wing could have come to be in the book. Definitely read the author's note if you read this book, because Geraldine Brooks gives you plenty of insight on her process and sort of what parts are fully fictionized and what parts are based in what kind of historical context. And this book, oh my gosh, I've recommended to several folks who like all of the things that I said when I first introduced this book. However, the one that I was probably most interested in the other edition, not this small paperback edition. So I hauled this from a Friends of the Library book sale, and I'm really excited to get this into a little free library. I think this is a great book for book lovers, and absolutely would recommend it to historical fiction readers and lovers of books. The last book I'm going to talk about in this video, because alas, it's already getting long, I mostly listened to, and it was a good listen. I appreciated listening to this. There were 2 narrators in the audio version of this book. One was a female voice female sounding voice for when there were female point of view protagonists, and one was a male sounding voice when there were male point of view protagonists. I appreciate Alice Munro's work on talking through gender, age, and sort of different life situations. I can absolutely see the craft of this author, the amazing craft of this author, and why an author such as this would be the winner of the Nobel Prize. I recently read The Black Book by Orhan Pamuk, which was also another Nobel Prize winner. So one really comes to notice the mastery of these authors. One thing I can say is that Munro gets out of short stories. I'm always like, one of the things about short stories is like, do you feel satiated, or do you want more from this character? Or do you feel like it was abruptly ended? And how do you end a short story? And Munro gets out of these short stories. Masterfully. I felt satiated by every single story in this book, where I am not that interested in exploring small town, or at least that's what I would say as I come from one. I thought her exploration of rural Canada and the characters and the people who live there and their lives, which through the course of them might not have a whole lot of action, I think is the word I'm going to use, but the way that Alice Munro really investigates how a certain event or certain events can change the trajectory of somebody's life and or their worldview is fantastic. Her characters are all incredibly relatable, and the humanity in this book seeps through. It was a great listen. I read a couple of them. I can't really, I really say, oh, one of my favorites, but they were all great, but one that just kind of threw me off in sort of this series was the one that's titled Inside of the Lake. I really appreciated that one. So glad I read this. Hauled this from a very local, like the little free library on my street. Got 2 bookmarks from it. And I'm really happy to get this back into the little free library ecosystem. This is a great book. If you're a reader and you like short stories that really highlight humanity, and or stories about small towns, really focusing on the characters in them, investigating things like how someone stands out as being different and is still accepted. This is so relatable in those terms. I guess probably because I came from a very rural place. Anyway, this was in the TBR, which was award winners, and this particular book was the winner of the Man Booker International Prize, and this author is a Nobel Prize winner. Definitely must read. If I come across another Munro out thrifting or in the library or in a little free library, I'll grab it. Absolutely read this book. I'm not saying it's the best thing I've ever read, but definitely read this book.